Let's go ahead and open up to John 21. John 21 to begin today's message. We are currently going through the book of Matthew, and we will get to chapter 12 in just a moment. But before we begin today's message, I thought it would be helpful for us to recognize that the gospel records of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the book of John, that they contain more than enough information that is necessary for us to understand in order that we might be able to attain salvation. However, it's important to recognize that not every detail about the life of Christ and his disciples is recorded in the New Testament books. There have been some over the years that have assembled what are referred to as harmonies of the four Gospels that put them in chronological order as best as can be determined, and some might call them the life of Jesus Christ. However, they are only his life in part. That is, his physical life as a man in part. And so what we have in the biblical record is inherently incomplete. And with this in mind, the authors will frequently use introductory phrases when beginning to tell the story of a particular conversation or an event. And they might say things like, now it came to pass, or at that time, or now it happened, or in those days. And then they will proceed recounting the narrative. The phrases that are used do not mean that every event that happened one after the other, nor do they mean that all that can be known leading up to a particular event was recorded in the Scriptures. And so we are currently going through the book of Matthew, and when we are going through these stories, we have referred to some of the other accounts of these events in the book of Mark and in the book of Luke. And these have shown us that some of the records of these events in the books are slightly out of order at times. Not out of context, but out of order. And many of the details before or after a particular event we see are not recorded at all. So if all of the details of Christ's life as a man, of his ministry throughout those 3 years, and all of the details of the work of his disciples was on record, we would have many more volumes of the Bible. Many volumes. 3, 4, 5, who knows how many we would have. And it was John, the Apostle John, who wrote this at the end of his gospel record in John 21 and verse 25. He said that there are also many other things, he said, that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would or could be written. Therefore, when a new topic or story begins in the Bible, we cannot assume that nothing else happened in between the incidents. You see, Christ and his disciples, they had spent 3 years together, going from place to place, preaching the gospel, doing many great works. And they spoke with many more people than is actually mentioned in the Bible. And Christ gave his disciples, we read in a previous chapter of the book of Matthew, that he gave his disciples miraculous powers to heal the sick, to even raise the dead at times. But not all of these healings or these miracles are mentioned in the books. And this is not because they didn't take place. It is because the authors were inspired to record what we need to know. Not everything we would like to know, but simply what we need to know. And so let's go over to Matthew in chapter 12. Matthew in chapter 12, and if you have a ribbon, go ahead and put it here, because we're going to be looking at some other verses as we move forward in the book of Matthew. And the point of recognizing this today is because there is some controversial behavior recorded in the book of Matthew in chapter 12. And there is a circumstance that is not exactly mentioned in any of the books. And it is something that the disciples faced at this time, and it caused them to pluck heads of grain on the Sabbath and to eat. And this act, recorded in the book of Matthew and in the book of Mark and in Luke, has caused thousands of Christians to believe that they are justified in doing business and dining out at restaurants on the Sabbath. Could this actually be true? Did Christ make a change in the fourth commandment that allows for such behavior? Or is it possible that he actually supplied evidence showing us that this event we are going to read was an acute situation that warranted unusual behavior at that time? And we're going to answer these questions as we go through the book of Matthew and in chapter 12, and we're only going to cover part of chapter 12 today. So let's go ahead and read the first verse, Matthew 12 and verse 1. It says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat." So here we have it. It says, "at that time," beginning the account of this incident. And we see, therefore, that at that time, it's not enough information to explain exactly what happened prior to this particular Sabbath, where the disciples were so hungry that they felt the need to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And as Luke describes, he describes them rubbing their hands together before they ate the grain, which would be something naturally you would do to remove the chaff or the outer part of the grain before one would eat it. And so all that the expression, the introductory phrase here, "at that time," does for us is it tells us that this took place during Christ's ministry. At that time, during Christ's ministry. And when we piece together other events in the books of Mark and Luke, we know that this particular time was the second year of Christ's ministry. But nothing is told exactly about what had occurred the previous night, the previous day, the previous days before this particular incident where they plucked heads of grain. However, several details that we are going to see in this dialogue between Christ and some Pharisees help us to understand that the disciples were so hungry that they felt that there was a need to pick raw food from the field on the Sabbath and to eat it on God's holy day, when we know that such work or such activity was not lawful. And we see this as we go forward. Notice the reaction now of some of the Pharisees in verse 2, some of the people that witnessed what the disciples were doing. It says, "And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him," to Christ, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now the Pharisees accused the disciples here of unlawful behavior. And notice that they did not accuse Christ of unlawful behavior. And the reason is because Christ did not pluck any of the grain and eat. It was only the disciples that did this. And both Mark and Luke, on their telling of this incident, confirm that this was the case. It was only the disciples. And the fact that Christ did not pluck heads of grain on the Sabbath shows us that this activity was, in fact, unlawful. He sanctioned it, but he did not do it himself. Let's look at Deuteronomy 23 for just a moment to help us to further understand what was going on here and why it was justified on this particular Sabbath at this particular time. Because on any other day of the week, any day except for the Sabbath, picking a few apples or a cucumber or a few handfuls of grain for sustenance would not have resulted in a railing accusation by the Pharisees. Because these men, these religious men, they were intellectual. They understood the scriptures to a degree, and they were aware of God's provision permitting individuals to occasionally eat some produce from a neighbor or another person's field. Now notice God's instructions about this in Deuteronomy 23 in verses 24 and 25, where it says, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of the grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container. In other words, you can gather enough to have a snack or a small meal, but you can't take some for later, for the road. And when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, in verse 25, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. In other words, you shall not reap it, larger amounts of food. Now, these instructions relate that individuals were able to pluck and to eat a meal's worth of produce from somebody else's field. That is, in order to satisfy hunger for that moment. It does not mean that people could gather enough food from a neighbor's field to sustain them or their families for several days. That would fall into the category of gleaning, which we'll talk about in just a moment here. But some actually believe, some in the Church of God actually believe that both a meal's worth of food or gleaning was acceptable work to be done on the Sabbath. Now keep in mind that gleaning requires much more effort, obviously, than gathering one person's meal's worth of food. Gleaning is gathering a larger amount of produce, and there is one Church of God minister that attempted to justify frequenting restaurants on the Sabbath, and he said this in a sermon, and I quote, he said, "The disciples ate grain from the field on the Sabbath. It was permissible to glean on the Sabbath. Therefore," he concluded, "it must be appropriate for us to dine out on the Sabbath." And he then proceeded to quote the verses we had just read in Deuteronomy 23, verses 24 and 25. Now notice the verses we had just read, they do not mention gleaning, do they? No, gleaning is mentioned in the next chapter. If you'd look at Deuteronomy 24, in verses 19 through 21, speaking of people that own fields and property, it says, "When you reap your harvest in your field, and you forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the eternal your God may bless you in all the work of your hand." So it's saying that you're supposed to leave some, Don't glean everything. And it says, it continues, "When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow." So do not be totally thorough in stripping your tree of all the fruit that's on it. Purposely leave some on the tree. "And when you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward," going back through it, making sure you got every bunch of grapes. "It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow." And so these instructions we see are very different from Deuteronomy 23, where it talks about gathering a meal's worth of food. One is allowing for a meal's worth and an individual's meal, and the other allows for the needy to gather a larger amount of produce that is purposely left over from the field or from the tree or from the vine. Nonetheless, neither of these circumstances allow for us to dine out on the Sabbath. Neither one of them, that is, were appropriate Sabbath behavior. And the Pharisees understood this. Look what your disciples are doing. They are doing that which is not lawful. And so it was not allowed to gather any kind of food, no matter what the quantity was, under normal circumstances. And that's important for us to recognize. Under normal circumstances, this was unlawful. And so let's look at Matthew 12 again. Go back to Matthew 12. I know this is a reminder to some of us that have studied this out, but we haven't talked about it in several years, and I think it's a good reminder. Perhaps we've forgotten, and I hope to introduce a few more interesting points about this incident today. And so the disciples had taken several handfuls of grain, and they did so to satisfy an immediate need for food. Now, what the disciples did would have been considered acceptable by the Pharisees if it were not the Sabbath. We saw that by reading Deuteronomy 23, also in 24. Gleaning was acceptable, but not on the Sabbath. But this was a Sabbath, and therefore the disciples' behavior was considered unlawful. And so what was unique, therefore? What was unique about their situation that allowed for Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath, to then defend their activity and sanction, therefore, plucking some heads of grain on the Sabbath. Well, that's why I began by mentioning that not everything is recorded in the Scriptures. The events prior to this are not written in any of the gospel records, but nonetheless, Christ proceeded to explain why he permitted the disciples to pick and to eat grain. And his explanation was given in an example of David and his unlawful use of the showbread when he was allowed to take it and to eat during a particular circumstance. And so let's look at verses 3 through 4 in Matthew 12. But he said to them, in his reply to the Pharisees who accused his disciples of doing that which is not lawful, he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but it was only for the priests?" And so he's reminding the Pharisees of this event, of a circumstance where David was not just hungry like we might think hungry, like we're ready for the next meal, but famished, where there was a circumstance he needed this food, him and his men, and he was allowed to take the showbread and eat it. Now consider a few points about this conversation so far and the example that Christ gave here explaining this justification for violating Sabbath protocol. If the disciples' act was lawful, Christ had every opportunity to simply say so, to tell them, you don't understand the law. This is perfectly fine to do on the Sabbath. No, instead, he cited the example of David, who did, in Christ's own words, David did that which was not lawful. Not lawful under ordinary circumstances. But the story of David and his use of the showbread show us that these were not ordinary circumstances, were they? No, and this alone, I think, discredits any belief that gathering food was permissible on any Sabbath a person might wish. So Christ compared the disciples to David who ate the showbread because these two circumstances were similar. 1 Samuel 22, keep your ribbon in Matthew 12, but go over to 1 Samuel 22. And let's just look at this account for a moment. The book of 1 Samuel and chapters 20 through 21 and then into 22, it records how David and his men had been running from their lives from King Saul, that they were on the run for 3 days. And these men were famished when they came to the place where the tabernacle stood. They had run out of food, and yet they were still needing to press on. Saul was still after them. However, even in their misery at this time, David did not take it upon himself to simply go into the tabernacle and to take the showbread. No, instead he approached the high priest, and he asked the high priest if the showbread could be given to him and his men. Now, this incident of David inquiring of the high priest was recorded in the book of Samuel, and it was witnessed by a man by the name of Doeg. And Doeg was an informant to King Saul, and he said this in 1 Samuel 22, in verses 9 through 10. He had explained how the high priest had assisted David in this way, and he said, "Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and he said to Saul, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, where the tabernacle stood, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub," and he was the high priest. "And David inquired of the Eternal for him." And the high priest, and he inquired of the Eternal for him. And he gave him provisions, and he gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So Ahimelech, he wore the ephod, and the ephod contained the stones of Urim and Thummim, and these were stones of judgment. They were used at times when to get a divine answer from God, when they needed a yes or no answer. They couldn't answer this themselves according to the law, and so they would go to God and ask for his judgment in the matter. Now Ahimelech, he inquired of the Eternal on behalf of David, and he asked if the showbread could be used by David and his men, because this was a dreadful situation. But some actually claim that Ahimelech did not inquire of the Eternal on behalf of David. And they say that Doeg's account of this was just a lie to King Saul. But even Ahimelech, if we read the story, we go further, Ahimelech admitted that he did inquire for David on behalf, or inquire of the Eternal on behalf of David. And he even said that I prayed to God frequently on behalf of David. And you shouldn't be surprised, Saul, that I inquired of the Eternal on his behalf at this time. And so the parallel in Christ's reminding the Pharisees of this incident is that when the high priest had inquired of David, he was actually inquiring of Christ. Christ is the I am that spoke to Moses. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He declared the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. And so when Ahimelech asked Christ if David could use the showbread, and Christ considered the difficult situation that David and his men were in, and he said yes. He said yes, he could use the showbread, and he did so through the ephod. And so the creator of the universe allowed for this law about the showbread to be violated at that time for the sake of helping David and helping him and his men in what is considered a type of an ox in a ditch situation. And so now we have Christ, the same God of the old covenant, standing before these Pharisees as a man, and he was giving his disciples permission to take some of the grain and to eat it on the Sabbath. And the reason is because theirs was a similar situation. Let's go back to Matthew 12. And so Christ's example here of citing David and the showbread shows us that his disciples were just as famished as David and his men. And the Savior exercised mercy in both of these instances. And this tells us that in such emergencies, that the Sabbath law or the penalty for violating the Sabbath law can be suspended. You see, if someone is in extreme hunger, if somebody is suffering from a diabetic episode, or if there is a genuine need in an act of mercy to alleviate pain or suffering, we can purchase food or medicine on the Sabbath to ease the suffering. But this does not give us the opportunity to eat out at restaurants on any Sabbath that we might please. Now, Christ continued with another example here of the type of work that is sanctioned by God on the Sabbath. And in verse 5, he said, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" And so the desecration of the Sabbath that Christ spoke of is the work that is commanded by God to be done by temple priests on the Sabbath. And in the book of Numbers, in chapter 28, every seventh day the priests were told to offer 2 lambs in their first year, 2/10 of an ephah of flour mixed with oil, and a drink offering. And this was to be offered on the Sabbath, including the regular burnt offering with its drink offering that was offered every single day. Now, it was work to perform these tasks. It was work that was to be done on the Sabbath. And yet Christ said that the priests were blameless in this work. Why? Why were they blameless? Well, the reason is because there are certain duties that must be performed on the Sabbath. And these tasks include work done by the ministry who are ministering servants to God and to his people. And so God is the only one that has the authority to permit certain types of work to be done on his Sabbaths. Now, when it comes to the work necessary to preserve life or to ease pain and suffering, God has made an allowance so that when there is a real need, that those people who profane the Sabbath by fulfilling that need will be considered blameless. Luke in chapter 14. Luke 14. Is there a real need, though? That is the question. How often is there a real need for us to go out to a restaurant on the Sabbath? It should be slim to none. Now consider another incident that illustrates this allowance, though, when there is a real need. And when Christ was asked about healing a man on the Sabbath who had suffered with, it calls it the dropsy. It's likely severe edema, probably because of heart failure. In Luke chapter 14, in verse 3, Jesus answering the lawyers and the Pharisees when they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" But they kept silent, and then Christ took him and healed this man and let him go. And then he answered these men and said, saying, "Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" He asked the question, which of you are not going to preserve life or property on the Sabbath? Nobody answered him, it says, and they could not answer him regarding these things. It's because each of them knew that there was an allowance, that you could preserve life or property or ease pain or suffering on the Sabbath. And so this is talking about a real need. It's a common expression today, an ox in a ditch, an ox in a ditch. I think people misuse the ox in the ditch situation today, because the problem in our age is that many try to excuse their profaning of the Sabbath by claiming that there is a real need when there is, it's not really necessary. You know, it'd kind of be like driving home from work on the preparation day on Friday. I might be driving home and I look at the gas gauge and it's all the way on empty, and I know I have enough gas to get home from work, but I'm thinking, you know, I need to drive to services tomorrow and I probably won't have enough gas to get to services. And then I might think, well, you know, it'll be an ox in the ditch tomorrow, so I'll just get it tomorrow instead. I don't feel like stopping to get gas right now. That's pushing the ox into the ditch. That's not really an ox in a ditch. We had every opportunity on the preparation day to get ready and to have the gas, to have those things, the provisions we might need on the Sabbath. But when people refuse to use the preparation day and then call it an ox in a ditch, it's really not. And it is profaning the Sabbath, and it will not be excused by God. Many in the Church of God have made dozens of excuses to dine out at restaurants on the Sabbath, thinking that their desecration, it's not really a big deal, or, you know, it really is a legitimate need. Oh, we got to eat, you know, of course we have to eat every Sabbath. We can buy food. There's one well-known minister who assumed that because Christ and the disciples were walking when the disciples plucked grain from this field, that they must have been traveling on the Sabbath. And this man presumptuously declared that, and I quote, he said, "Jesus changed the law regarding the Sabbath so that we can eat out on the Sabbath when we travel." That is a bold claim. Jesus changed the law. Well, first, the scriptures never indicate that Christ and his disciples were at the end of some long journey on the Sabbath, and therefore that they were traveling, quote-unquote traveling, on the Sabbath. And second, the account never even remotely hints that Jesus changed the fourth commandment. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And he even said that he came that he didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill, meaning he came to live by every word of God, by the word of the law and the prophets. And so how could it be that those who claim that the commandments were not done away, as so many professing Christians do today, that they assume that this circumstance here somehow introduced a major change to the Sabbath law? It's ridiculous if you think about it. It's preposterous. It is a lie. Even if that person who made such a claim doesn't know that it's a lie, it's false nonetheless. Something else to consider is the fact that everyone today travels in order to get to church service. And I think traveling it's a relative term, isn't it? One could be considered traveling if they are just walking a few blocks down the street. It could be traveling just driving a few miles, or it could be traveling driving a few hundred miles in a single day. But it really doesn't matter, does it? regardless of the distance that is traveled, in order to be justified in doing business and frequenting a restaurant or going to a restaurant on the Sabbath, there has to be a circumstance that did not allow for the individual to prepare ahead of time. We cannot misuse the preparation day. We cannot ignore the preparation day and then think that we are somehow justified in breaking the Sabbath the next day. There has been no change, brethren, in the fourth commandment. Any law that was altered in the New Testament is stated, explained in detail. And so we see that was the case with circumcision, explained in several of Paul's books and also explained in detail in the council in Acts in chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council of Elders. We see that animal sacrifices are not required at this time. They're suspended, but they will be required when Christ returns. We see that the symbols that are used for the Passover were altered. Not done away with, but altered. And that was explained in the Gospels by Christ's doing, and also the Apostle Paul, who said that Christ showed him personally that these were the symbols that were to be used. Instead of the lamb and the blood, it was going to be bread, unleavened bread, and wine. And so nothing else was changed in the New Testament. And so those who believe that the Sabbath commandment has been altered because of our age, with all of our modern conveniences, everything that's handy at our fingertips, they're sadly mistaken. And so to teach that Christ changed the law regarding the Sabbath observance is actually, it's the same kind of blasphemous argument, the rhetoric that's used by Protestants who claim that the commandments were nailed to the cross and they are no longer required by believers today. Let's go back to Matthew 12. Even though Christ and the disciples were not traveling a long distance on the Sabbath, we know that something must have occurred prior to this incident that left the disciples without the ability to have food to eat on the Sabbath day. Now, something else that I noticed while going through this again, rehashing it another time, is that the first verse, Matthew wrote that the disciples were hungry. And he also described in quoting Christ, he said that David and his men were hungry. Now the King James translation, I'm using the New King James, the King James translation says that they were unhungered. And what many do not realize is that this expression means more than simply being ready to eat the next meal. Or perhaps they didn't have enough for breakfast and they're ready for a snack. You see, consider the fact that we live in a country where most of us have multiple choices of food at our fingertips every single day and night. And so when you and I say that we are hungry, it usually means it's a casual form of hunger that we're ready to eat the next meal. We would like a little snack. Therefore, I think our impression of being hungry, it is more of a casual hunger, and it's not being famished, like David and his men. And yet the scriptures say he was hungry. And for this reason, I think because of our age and because of what we are used to day in and day out, I think we might tend to minimize the description, the adjective of somebody being hungry in the scriptures. But consider this, that the Bible tells us those things that are important, those things that we really need to know. And so when they describe an individual as being hungry or hungered, there's a good reason why it's stated. It's not just casual hunger. So it was noteworthy to the authors of the four Gospels because it means more than something than you and I might be familiar with. These men were very hungry, likely to the point of fatigue, just like David and his men, which is why Christ gave us the example of David using the showbread. So Christ gave the example showing that the Sabbath commandment can be suspended only when there is a legitimate need to preserve life or to ease pain and suffering, and when there was no ability to utilize the preparation day. And he then explained that God sanctified the priesthood, that these men were instructed to perform certain duties on the Sabbath that was work. And if it was not sanctioned by God, it would otherwise be a violation of the law. And so Christ then declared his authority in this matter in Matthew 12, in verses 6 through 8. He said, "Yet I say to you that in this place," speaking to these men right now, "there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So Christ said that the temple duties by the priesthood were allowed to be carried out on the Sabbath because those men were ministering servants to God and to the temple. And he then said that he was even greater than the temple. Why would he say that? Well, the reason is because the temple and the priesthood were designed to serve him, to serve God. He is the eternal, the Yahweh of the Old Covenant. He is the individual that rested on the seventh day after creating the flora and fauna that you and I are familiar with, and he is the one that sanctioned the seventh day, sanctified it. And so Christ, we see in this account here, that you can read the other accounts in Mark and in the book of Luke, that he never challenged the Pharisees' understanding of Sabbath protocol. He did not indicate that plucking a meal's worth of food on the Sabbath is always acceptable. Instead, he gave the example of an extreme situation, and then, in the verses we had just read, he questioned the accuser's understanding of mercy. So Christ told them the same thing that he told Israel. We see quoted in the book of Hosea 6 and verse 6. When he told Israel, when they were going off track, he said he desired mercy and not sacrifice. And so this means that Christ desires a real commitment to live by every word of God. And not just vain oblation, not just going through the motions. He desires for us to understand the do's and don'ts of the law and why, and not to go out and start accusing others without considering their circumstance. Mark in chapter 2, and we're going to end in Mark. God is merciful, which is an expression of love. And when there is a legitimate need to pull an ox out of a ditch on the Sabbath, he will suspend judgment in such a matter. However, God will not suspend judgment when people do not use the preparation day, and then they claim, well, we have a real need to do business and to pay people to work for us, to cook for us, to serve us our food and clean up for us on the Sabbath, when there is truly no real need to profane the Sabbath day. As Christ said to the Pharisees, at the same time, and this is Mark's account of the same event, and this phrase or this statement here is not mentioned in the book of Matthew, but it is definitely worth noting. Mark 2, and in verse 27, Christ said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And therefore the Son of Man is also Lord," or master of the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath was made for man to observe. Man was not made to do whatever he might please on the Sabbath. And God said to Israel numerous times, and he says to us, "Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep." And God also said, I gave you my Sabbaths to be a sign between him and us, that he is our God, and that we are his people. And so what does it say to him if we do refuse to keep the Sabbath protocol and to defame his Sabbath or defile it? God told Israel, he said that they had, when they had gone off track, he said that they had greatly defiled my Sabbaths. And this is one of the reasons that Israel went into captivity. And I suggest it will be a reason that there will be a future punishment of those people who claim to know the law, but they choose to defile the Sabbaths instead without a good reason. And so the disciples plucking a few handfuls of grain does not justify going to a restaurant on the Sabbath. The example shows us that anyone desiring to pick some handfuls of food on the Sabbath from a vine or a tree or from a field, or anyone who would like to purchase food on the Sabbath, that they must be in a similar situation to David and his men. They must have been able to prepare prior to the Sabbath day. It must be a genuine ox in a ditch type of situation where there is pain, that there is suffering, and there is life or property being threatened. In conclusion, there's no question that plucking a few handfuls of grain on the Sabbath was unlawful. Even so, the Messiah said that his disciples were guiltless because he was the Lord of the Sabbath, and he expressed mercy, and he authorized their behavior in what was a difficult situation that he compared to David and the showbread. That was a situation where there was extreme hunger, and yet it was allowed an unlawful use of the showbread.